It's the Happy Families Podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Hello, it's Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm here with my wife and mum to our 6 kids, Kylie, Mrs. Happy Families. Just a quick note, today's content is probably for sensitive ears. If you've got little kids listening, you may want to be judicious and discerning in terms of what they listen to in this podcast. Non-stop talk in the news at the moment around harm to women at the hands of men. And this is doing the rounds on TikTok. It's a fascinating conversation.
Okay. If you had to leave your daughter in the forest with either a man or a bear, which would you choose?
Well, I think both options kind of suck. I don't know this man. Oh, gosh. Don't know anything about the man.
No, nothing about the man.
Anything about the bear?
Nothing about the bear.
Oh, my gosh. I feel like it's an impossible choice. Which just shows you how much I don't trust other people. I don't know. The man.
I was going to say,
man.
Define, okay. If you had to leave your daughter in the woods with a woman or a bear.
Oh, woman. Oh.
The fact that we live in a society where that's what women have to deal with all the time. Of the fear. You felt the fear of leaving your daughter in the woods with a man.
Yeah.
This is how women feel walking to their cars at night.
No, like the level of thinking one of my kids, trusting my kid with a bear or a strange man is a horrifying position. Like, is that a horrifying walking to your car by yourself?
If there's just a man there?
Oh, you see like a man? Oh,
yes.
You see like a dude?
Yeah.
Oh, no, that makes sense. And okay, I got it.
Is that shocking to you?
Yes, very shocking. That's very eye-opening.
Okay, so TikTok is primarily filled with a whole lot of people who don't have any credentials or qualifications talking about a whole lot of things that they're not really qualified to talk about. Nevertheless, it's taking over the world. It has taken over the world. But this particular thing really grabbed me, and I've been thinking about it nonstop since I heard it. There's a lot that I don't like about it, but boy, oh boy, there's some really important stuff here. Kylie, you haven't spoken yet in this podcast because you're not feeling great.
Well, after your warning at the beginning of the podcast, I thought it might be because the kids would be scared by my voice.
So I don't know how this is going to work out. But other than the fact that you're feeling kind of awful, what are your comments? What are your initial reactions when you think about that conversation? How would you feel about handing over your child, one of our daughters, to either a man or a bear, leaving them in the forest with either a man or a bear? How hard is that decision?
Well, you know, growing up with Jungle Book, there is a little bit of romanticizing in my mind that maybe it was Baloo that I might be leaving my
Mowgli will be safe with the wolves. It'll be okay.
But what really stood out to me as I listened to that time and time again was just he eventually got to the point where it's like, it's obvious I'm going to have to leave her with the man.
But I don't like it.
But when it came to the second question of whether he would leave it with a woman or a bear, it was an instant easy yes.
Yeah, and that's the problem, right? So I've been thinking about it nonstop as well. And you don't even have to hesitate. Woman or bear? A woman, absolutely. Man or bear? Oh, can I phone a friend? Can I have a lifeline? Can I get a 50-50 here?
But what I actually found most interesting is it wasn't a conversation between two women. It was a conversation with a man, and even a man could see the challenge of leaving their daughter with another man.
This really hurts me though. So I wanted to sort of say hashtag not all men. And that's a really common response by guys. Guys get really defensive about this and they say, yeah, but I'm not like that. We've got this national conversation happening around gendered violence at the moment. And the reason this is so effective is because when a man has to pause and consider, do I trust other men? That's when the issue really rears its head. Now, many men are not safe. Far too many men are not safe. And that number seems to be rising. We'll talk about that later. But the thing that really hurts me is so many men are. And yet those ones who, they really ruin it for everybody. The men that I spent time with, like across the weekend just gone, we spent some time with several different friends and also part of our church community. I was thinking, because of this conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about how exceptional, like how truly, truly exceptional those men were that we were with. They're safe men. And I would absolutely, unflinchingly leave our kids with pretty much all of those, certainly the ones that we know, without any hesitation at all. Just yes. But that's the thing. You don't get to choose that. And when you're walking down the street, you don't get to, or even when you enter a relationship with a guy, you don't get to say, oh, well, this one I can trust. It takes time. And we even know people who the guys that they married suddenly changed within a couple of weeks of being married. It was all of a sudden it was Jekyll and Hyde. They weren't who they'd been prior to the marriage. Really, really, really challenging. And the other thought that I had was, even though I'm thinking about all the good examples of great men that I know, when I go surfing, for example, sometimes, depending on where I'm surfing and depending on who's in the water, I look at the guys that I'm surfing with and I just think, oh my goodness, how terrifying. I would absolutely, under no circumstances, no way would I link my daughters with some of these men. I mean, they're intimidating for me. They're absolutely scary.
I know that for so many women, this is real, and the experiences that they have had or are in the midst of having are absolutely life-altering, heartbreaking. But I don't want to live my life where I have to second-guess the safety of half the human race based on their gender. And I don't want my children being raised. I have 6 daughters, and I want them to live with confidence and with the notion that most people are good people.
That's really tricky, though, because when you look at the way our children have, like we've got several children who are now adults, and they've all had some pretty difficult experiences with young men. Like their dating experiences, their being out and about with young men, they haven't had universally positive experiences there. And what they've learned is that overwhelmingly, you can't trust a guy when you're on a date and you're alone with him. That's what they've learned.
Just the other weekend, one of our daughters was out with some friends at the beach, and towards the end of the evening, it was now dark, her and her girlfriend went up to the car park to wait for her friend's mum to come and get them. And her mum was about 20 minutes away. As the boys left, they checked in with the girls and found out that, you know, they were going to be waiting for 20 minutes. And the girls acknowledged that they were completely fine and safe and they were happy for the boys to leave. Well, the girls actually thought the boys had left, but what they did was they went and sat in their car. And from their car, they could actually see the girls. But at some point in that 20 minutes, the girls moved from where they were. And our daughter got a phone call to say, hey, have you guys been picked up yet? And our daughter said, no, we're still waiting. They said, we just can't see where you are. And at that point, they realised that the boys had been waiting. And they said, why are you waiting for us? We're completely fine. And they just said, we're not going to leave until you go. And so they got off the phone after they tried to convince the boys that it was okay for them to leave. And it wasn't until they were in the car with the girlfriend's mum that the boys gave one last phone call and said, okay, you guys are good. Great. We'll see you at school on Monday.
So I love the goodness of those boys in the car park. I think that's really important. But at some level, when I hear that story, that also tells me that those boys are there because of what they know about the boys who aren't like them. That highlights to me that there's some really, really great kids out there, really good boys, but they know that compared to the other boys, they are different, they are good, and that there's a whole lot of boys that that they need to protect our daughter and her friends from. I spoke with a girl just in the last 24 hours who is routinely sat next to on public transport by boys and men, even when there are spare seats nearby, because they like the look of her. I mean, that's awful. That for me, when I'm traveling, and I do a lot of travel, if I see a woman walking down the street, often my events finish at like 9 o'clock at night or something like that. I'm heading back to a hotel. I'm walking into a hotel at 10 o'clock at night. If I see a woman walking down the street towards me, I'll even walk to the other side of the street just so that she doesn't have to wonder about the guy that's walking towards her. If I'm getting into an elevator and there's a woman waiting, I'll often just say, hey, you grab this one, I'll get the next one, because I don't want a woman to feel uncomfortable. I don't want her to feel afraid. I don't think that she needs to be afraid of me. Obviously, I'm not someone to be afraid of, but I get, because I've got a wife and 6 daughters and a mum and several sisters and all that sort of thing, I get that for women, being around some men can be really intimidating.
This won't be a popular response, but when I look at what we're dealing with and I hear this, I can't put the blame all on men. There has been such a massive breakdown of family over the years, and it is having a devastating effect on everyone. But this really comes down to parents stepping up and taking on their role as parents, as moral leaders within our society, and teaching our boys and our girls what it means to live a moralistic life.
Once upon a time, a guy called Augustine of Hippo said, right is right, even if no one is doing it. Wrong is wrong, even if everyone is doing it. In a postmodern world, right is whatever feels good for you. And as we've become increasingly individualistic and we shrugged our shoulders and said, oh, well, whatever works for you so long as you're not hurting other people, that has led in so many ways to that degradation, walking away from the values, walking away from what we know traditionally has kept people, and specifically boys and men, in check. Now, I don't want to keep on forcing you to talk because I know how sore your throat is, but over the last couple of weeks, there's been a whole lot of rallies and a whole lot of people petitioning the government saying we need to do something about this.
I'm just wondering what people expect politicians to be able to do in this scenario.
Yeah, so they made 5 demands at these rallies. Number one, they want to declare domestic violence a national emergency. I mean, absolutely, no problem at all. We need to be able to say that this needs resources and this needs time and effort. Number 2, mandatory victim blaming prevention training for police, media and first responders. That means that they're essentially saying we want first responders to believe women when they say there's something going wrong. I think that is right, but there also is a risk associated with that because we've got good evidence that there are some people who will use this as a weapon against men who haven't done anything wrong. It's a minority of people, but it does happen because people game the system to get the outcomes that they want. Nevertheless, I think overall that is a really wise step. Number 3, alternative reporting options for victims so that they don't have to just go through the official channels. There should be other ways that they can report what they're afraid of. Number 4, media to wait 48 hours before identifying victims. And number 5, better funding. Now, my problem with most of these is that they're ambulances at the bottom of the cliff. It's well-intentioned, but I think that it's missing the point. There are actually things that can act as a fence at the top of the cliff and stop boys and men hurting women.
What would you suggest?
So I'm going to highlight a couple of things that are not politically correct, but data certainly supports them. I'm going to offend pretty much everybody with what I'm going to say here. But number 1, there's a lack of security and family life for too many of our young men and young women growing up. And that leads them to seek support and relational belonging in places that are not healthy and not safe. Reading a book at the moment about a young man who went through the foster care system in the United States, not much different to Australia in terms of the unpredictability and the difficulty that he had in forming good relationships, the lack of male role models, the breakdown of community institutions that build up and taught morality, as imperfect as many of them are, and they are. We had community support. We had structures in place. We had expectations in place for how people would act. I'm not suggesting we go back to the bad old days because there was a lot bad that happened. However, we do know that things have gotten worse. There is no doubt about that. I think one of the easiest places to start is with the degradation of community standards. It's a huge part of this. I'm going to get really explicit for a sec. If you've got kids listening, this is the 30 to 60 seconds that you don't want them to listen. I was speaking with a journalist the other day and she was describing a family member conversation that she'd had with a niece of hers, young adult niece, who was having a really hard time in relationships and finding a guy that she could trust. And the conversation turned explicit and extreme very, very quickly. And this girl described to her aunt, my friend the journalist, about how in her relationships with these young men, choking and hitting and anal sex were expected, even on a first date. And this friend just looked at her and said, that's not normal. And her niece responded, no, but it is normal. That's the expectation. When we look at the content that is being consumed by young people, pornography, the Albanese government won't even age gate it. Recommendations from the E-Safety Commissioner last year were that we need to get at least a trial in place where we age gate access to explicit content. They're doing it in other countries around the world, other states of the United States of America, and the Albanese government pushed back and said, no, we can't. Why? Because we're so worried about the civil liberties of a handful of adults that we're not going to look after our young people. We're going to present them with every risk factor in the world so that adults can have freedom of choice. It's just ridiculous. Kyle and Jackie O have been on the radio in Melbourne for a week now. Last week and the week before, I've had 2 reports. So Craig Bruce is our executive producer. He once upon a time, back in the olden days, he was the content director for the entire Southern Cross Stereo network. And he was the content director when Kyle and Jackie came off the night program and became the breakfast announcers at Today FM. Now, back then, Kyle called a woman, and this is a direct quote, a fat slag. And he was reprimanded. This thing was sent to the advisory bodies, the peak body. It was a big deal. In the last 2 weeks, I've heard content from Kyle and Jackie's show because Craig sent it to me, where they've talked about anal sex. They've talked about how big Jackie's vagina is. They've talked about her walking around with semen. In fact, they didn't use the word semen. They used a much more profane term for that, walking around all day with that in her stomach. There is no filter. There is absolutely no filter. Why is this a problem? Because they're the number one breakfast show in Sydney. Now they're in Melbourne. They've got more than 1 million daily listeners. And these discussions normalise sexualisation and objectification. They were talking about being on a dance floor and not knowing who was fingering you. I'm sorry, I know I'm being really explicit, but our kids are listening to this. They're the number one show. This is not a podcast. This is not hidden behind an age gate. This is content that is available for everyone. And what it does is it shifts This was between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. It's blowing my mind. And it shifts expectations and builds a belief and changes subsequent behavior because people think this is what people do. But it's normal. If you go back to the young woman that was talking to the journalist friend of mine, but it's normal. And this stuff matters. So ultimately, I mean, it sounds like I'm on a moral soapbox right now, but parenting is a moral endeavor. And when we remove morality from most of the institutions of our society, including in too many cases our families, because of the proliferation of pornography, because of the coarseness and degradation of the community content, because of the breakdown of the institutions, and because families just aren't talking about this sort of stuff, this is the result. Now, people keep on saying we shouldn't have to teach our girls to stay safe. We need to teach boys to stop hurting and being violent and worse. And that's true. That's absolutely true. But here's the thing. The world is not perfect. And we actually need to do both. Fewer perpetrators, completely essential, absolutely needed, but we can't tarnish all boys either because there are some beautifully good boys that are out there and we interact with many of them and we're so grateful for them. There was a school in Warrnambool a couple of years ago that made all the boys stand up and apologise to the girls for being boys because of the terrible things that boys do to girls. And that was appalling. It was rightly condemned. But Kylie, this isn't going to be quickly fixed at a national level. No level of political involvement is really going to make this happen. It's something that has to be fixed at an individual level and at a family level. We've got the evidence and we know that there are so many good men and so many good boys. We've got to get to a point where if you're asked if you would rather leave your daughter with a man or a bear, you can answer just as quickly as you can if you're given the choice between a bear and a woman. Got to be able to say a man and feel good about it. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. We hope that this one's given you plenty of food for thought. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow on the podcast answering your questions from the podcast page at happyfamilies.com.au.